The Chinese Navy celebrates its 70th anniversary by hosting a naval parade with dozens of foreign navies participating. What can China do to reassure international critics that its modernizing navy is primarily for defensive purposes? And the head of the International Telecommunication Union arrives for the second Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. I will conduct a live interview with its Secretary General Zhao Houling. Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. As the Chinese economy has grown, transforming itself into the world's second largest economy, so too has China's military. Chinese society is understandably proud of their military's progress, as viewers could see in Tuesday's festivities to celebrate the Chinese Navy's 70th anniversary. Not only was Chinese naval weaponry on display, but its leadership as well. The navies of some 60 countries were also represented at the Maritime Parade in Qingdao, a port city in East China's Shandong province. That said, the view from outside of China is quite different. Quite a few military leaders and political observers expressed concern about the growing progress of the Chinese Navy. So how can China reassure the rest of the world that the Navy's modernization is for defensive needs and not for offensive purposes? And how can China respond to the sensitivity on the part of its neighbors or the West about its growing military strengths? Joining me for our discussion in the Beijing studio is Professor Zhu Chenghu, PLA, National Defense University from Moscow, Pavel Falkenhauer, a Russian political and defense analyst, and from New Delhi, India, Professor Shrikant Kondapalli from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Professor Zhu, let me go to you first. Explain to us exactly where are we in terms of the prowess of the Chinese Navy. On the one hand, the Chinese people are proud, but on the other hand, we believe we're not there yet. On the one hand, we want to have a powerful Navy, but on the other hand, we don't want others to fear us. How powerful is China's Navy compared with its past and its international peers?
Well, I think that we have made very big progress in the development of Chinese PLA Navy, and the progress could be witnessed at this parade. It's mainly manifested in the following. One is development of the aircraft carrier, which is only one in service now, but China will continue to develop it. Secondly, we have developed large-scale surface ships, which will be the backbone forces of the Navy. And third, we have developed the strategic nuclear deterrent submarine, which is elaborated by some of the outsiders strategic deterrent force. And of course, we also made progress in the reorganization of the Navy, and we have developed five arms or 5 branches of the Navy, which is similar to most of the navies in the Western developed countries. Of course, this is development.
Yeah. But if we're going to rate China's Navy in the world, where would you say China is?
Comparatively speaking, I think China is far away from the United States, and other navies like Japan or even Britain, UK or France. And of course, I believe that we will continue to develop, and of course, I hope that the outsiders can understand it, because the PLA modernization drive was delayed because of the major emphasis was put on the economic development. That is to say, the PLA did not develop together with the economic and the social development of China since the introduction of the policy of reform and opening to the outside. We started the modernization drive actually in late 1990s. That is following the cross-trade crisis in 1995 and then 1996. At that time, we witnessed the danger of Taiwan being permanently separated from the mainland, and we felt very realistic threats from our side.
Okay, let me go to our guest from Russia, Mr. Pavel Felgenhauer. Pavel, observing from Russia, how do you rate China's Navy in comparison with military powers in the West and with Russia?
Well, the Chinese Navy has, of course, made a great progress, and it's kind of logical because when China was a closed country, it had the brown water coastal defense navy. When it became the world major trading power and industrial power, it now needs a blue water navy to keep the trading routes open. And that's, of course, and if you first begin developing escort ships, destroyers and frigates, then you see you need aircraft carriers because these ships need air cover in far-off waters, and only an aircraft carrier can provide it. The Chinese Navy as such is not seen by the Russian Navy as an enemy or actually a competitor of any serious sort. The Russian Navy has its kind of zeroed its on America and its allies, NATO allies. Chinese interests not cross with the Russians much at all. Of course, maybe there is some envy with the very big Chinese shipbuilding program, the new Chinese aircraft carriers. China has right now 2, Russia has 1, and there are problems with the only Russian left aircraft carriers, so maybe Russian admirals envy to some extent, but don't see the Chinese as a real competitor in places which are seen vital to the Russian Navy. That's the Barents Sea, the Sea of Okhotsk, where our strategic nuclear missile-carrying submarines are deployed.
Okay. Professor Kondapolli, we understand that 2 Indian Navy ships joined in the PLA naval celebration, the first visit to China by Indian warships in nearly 2 years since the border standoff near Donglang or Doklam between China and India. So how is China's Navy and its development seen from the Indian side?
Well, as my friend Dr. Chu Chang-Hu mentioned, the Chinese naval development began in the late 1950s, mainly due to the threat perceptions in the region. Also, I would suggest the Chinese economic development to become the 2nd largest economy is based on the maritime domain in terms of exports and imports. Over $4 trillion out of nearly $12 trillion GDP of China is on the high seas, especially the trade with US, EU, Japan, ASEAN countries, South Korea. Much of this trade is through the oceanic waters. Secondly, through the Indian Ocean, some 300 odd million tons of oil is flowing into China, 80% of these through the Straits of Malacca. So to that extent, there is the maritime domain which is important, in which China has legitimate interests. That has kick-started the modernization, and we have seen spectacular development also reflected in the International Fleet Review in Qingdao. With so many countries participating, I think it, number one, provides for a legitimacy for China in terms of the maritime domain awareness. Number two, it also provides for a kind of conventional deterrence capacity. That China has some red lines, amber lines, green lines, in which it will do business in the maritime navy domains. So this is another feature that is reflective. Third most important, I think the Qingdao Fleet Review would also provide for a certain bonhomie between the participating navies.
Okay. Professor Zhu, let me go to the view that I mentioned about anxiety, about anxiousness on some more developed countries in the West. For instance, at Chinese Navy's 69th anniversary last year, the Navy unveiled the country's first domestically built aircraft carrier. And the New York Times quoted a Chinese military news website as stating that China's first homegrown aircraft carrier just moved a bit at the United United States, Japan and India squirmed. The paper also added that the comment referred to three nations China views as its main rivals. So should the U.S., Japan and India view Chinese Navy as a threat? Why or why not?
I think it's quite unnecessary for them to view China's Navy as a threat. First, the Chinese Navy is quite, comparatively speaking, is quite weak with the United States, with U.S. Navy. Secondly, as my Indian friend mentioned, that we have a lot of interest to protect. China's trade, as well as the lifeline of the economy is on the sea, so we need the protection from the Chinese Navy. Thirdly, as China is developing stronger in the economic sense, I think China should provide more public goods for the world community. For example, in the past 10 years or so, we provided escort fleet to Gulf of Aden and the Somalia maritime area. And this played a very important role. It provided escort operations for more than 6,000 ships, and not only Chinese ships, but also the ships from outside all over the world.
Okay.
And of course, in the future, I believe that the Chinese Navy can provide much more public goods to the world.
However, the same New York Times article specifically cited concerns about the Pacific Ocean, stating that China's modernizing military has shifted the balance of power, with the Pacific once again becoming contested territory. So, Pavel, do you think that China's Navy increasing in its military prowess and its strengths is likely to heighten the tension in the waters immediately surrounding the Chinese mainland, for instance, the Taiwan Straits, or in the South China Sea?
Well, foreign navies and experts sometimes actually exaggerate the Chinese naval capabilities and aggravate their intentions for obvious reasons, because everyone needs money. Any navy needs money, because naval equipment and ships are very, very expensive. And if you want to get money from your government or your parliament, you need to present a credible threat. That means in the threat assessment there's going to be exaggeration all the time, because everyone needs more money on all sides. So that means you have to kind of see those assessments with a pinch of salt, because there's a obvious reason why they're being so kind of calamity about it. The Chinese are going to threaten someone. Right now it's not that. The Chinese Navy, of course, is no match for the American one globally, and is not really, China doesn't have an intention to move into the middle of the Pacific Ocean and fight a war like Japan did in 41-45 with the American Navy, did it unsuccessfully. So China doesn't have no interest there to do so.
All right. Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my guests. Unfortunately, I won't be able to go to our guest in India for a second question. Many thanks for Professor Konopoli for having stayed with us and for having participated in the show nevertheless. And also thanks, of course, to Professor Zhu Chenghu and Pavel Falkenhauer joining us from Beijing and Moscow, respectively. You're watching The Point with me, Li Xin. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, the head of the International Telecommunication Union will explain how his organization's deepening relationship with China could enhance telecoms around the world. Stay with us.